Louisiana, 1945. The barracks stood silent in the heavy afternoon heat, weathered wood darkening under clouds that promised rain, but delivered nothing. Inside, Sergeant James Crawford gripped the fabric of a woman's dress-gray cotton, military issue, standard for prisoners, and tore it down the center with both hands. The sound echoed like a gunshot. The German woman stood absolutely still, eyes forward, breath shallow. Outside, 2 MPs froze mid-stride. What they witnessed next would be written in official reports, whispered in mess halls, and debated in Washington. But the truth behind that torn dress would remain buried for decades. Camp Rustin sprawled across northern Louisiana like a small city of wire and watchtowers. Pine trees bordered the compound, their shadows stretching long in the late afternoon sun. Heat pressed down on everything: the guard posts, the rows of barracks, the administrative buildings where typewriters clacked in rhythm with industrial fans that did nothing but move hot air from one side of the room to the other. Private Eleanor Hoffman watched from the window of the medical ward as the trucks arrived. March 1945. The war in Europe was entering its final, desperate phase. But here in Louisiana, another kind of war was being waged, the war of repatriation, documentation, and the processing of thousands upon thousands of prisoners who had crossed the Atlantic in cargo holds and troop ships. The women came last. Always last. They descended from the canvas-covered trucks in groups of 15, 20 at a time. Gray dresses that hung shapeless on frames that had known hunger. Heads uncovered, hair cut short or pulled back tight. Some wore shoes. Others had only strips of cloth wrapped around their feet. Eleanor counted 47 women that afternoon. She would remember this number for the rest of her life. Among them, Greta Friedland, 28 years old, formerly of Hamburg, a nurse in the German auxiliary forces, captured near Aachen as the Western Front collapsed. She carried nothing: no bags, no personal items, not even a photograph. Everything had been taken during processing in New York, cataloged, stored, or destroyed. Greta's eyes moved across the camp with professional efficiency. Guard towers 8, visible from this angle. Barbed wire 3 rows, standard spacing. Male prisoners in the distant compound, perhaps 500, based on the barracks count. And watching from the medical ward window, a young American woman in uniform, observing with what Greta recognized as medical training. A nurse watching nurses. Their eyes met for 3 seconds. Neither looked away. Camp Rustin held over 4,000 prisoners by the spring of 1945. The men worked in forests, on farms, in factories that produced goods for the war effort under strict guidelines established by the Geneva Convention. They received wages in camp scrip, could purchase cigarettes and toiletries, played soccer on designated fields. The administrative machinery of captivity had become efficient, almost routine. The women existed in a different category entirely. 73 female prisoners of war in a camp designed for men. The military had scrambled to create separate facilities, a cluster of barracks hastily partitioned. Guard schedules adjusted to include female personnel, regulations rewritten almost daily as questions arose that no one had anticipated. What clothing should they receive? Who would conduct medical examinations? What work assignments were appropriate? Major Thomas Garrett, camp commandant, had received exactly one directive from Washington: maintain absolute separation from male prisoners, ensure appropriate supervision, and document everything. The War Department was already thinking ahead to post-war tribunals, to questions that would be asked by the Red Cross, by international observers, by history itself. Greta and the other women were assigned to Barracks 7 and 8. The buildings smelled of fresh paint and sawdust. Someone had installed curtains, white cotton, government issue, already yellowing in the Louisiana humidity. 6 beds per room, thin mattresses on metal frames, a small table, 1 chair, a single window that looked out onto the guard path, and beyond that, the pines. That first evening, a female corporal brought them clothing. Gray cotton dresses, all the same size, designed for efficiency rather than fit. Undergarments, 2 pairs of socks each. Shoes would come later, after measurements were taken. Greta held the dress up to the fading light. The fabric was rough, institutional, but clean. So clean. She had worn the same uniform for 6 weeks through capture, processing, transport, and quarantine. The American dress smelled like laundry soap and nothing else. No sweat, no fear, no history. She put it on. It hung loose around her shoulders, tight across the hips. The hem fell unevenly, longer in back than in front. She looked down at herself and felt something unexpected, relief. This dress meant she was no longer in transit, no longer being moved from place to place like cargo. She was here, wherever here was, and here had beds and curtains and dresses that smelled clean. That night, lying on the thin mattress while Louisiana insects screamed outside the window, Greta allowed herself to think about what came next. The war would end soon, everyone knew this, even if no one spoke it aloud. Germany was collapsing. The regime's final broadcasts had grown shrill and desperate. And then what? Return to Hamburg? To what? The city had been burning for years. Her apartment was almost certainly ash. Her hospital demolished in 1943. Her parents, she had received no letters in 18 months. Better not to think about it. Better to focus on immediate things. The dress, the bed. The fact that she was, for the first time in months, not moving. James Crawford had enlisted in 1942, 3 months after Pearl Harbor. He was 31 years old, married, with 2 daughters he had last seen as toddlers, who now sent him crayon drawings of houses and trees and stick-figure families. He had expected to go overseas. Instead, the Army had made him a sergeant and assigned him to Camp Rustin, where he supervised work details, managed logistics, and processed paperwork for thousands of prisoners who spoke limited English and ate better than many American civilians. He did not think of himself as a particularly patient man, but the work required patience. Explaining instructions through translators, mediating disputes between prisoners over trivial matters, sleeping arrangements, work assignments, perceived slights that seemed absurd given the larger context of global war. Maintaining discipline without brutality, which was harder than it sounded when dealing with men who had, weeks or months earlier, been trying to kill Americans. The arrival of female prisoners complicated everything. New protocols, new paperwork, new liability. The camp had female personnel, nurses, administrative staff, the WACs, who ran the motor pool, but they were American military. These were enemy combatants. Auxiliaries, technically, but the distinction seemed meaningless when you were responsible for their custody, their safety, their processing. Crawford's CO had been blunt. No incidents. No fraternization. No photographs. The Red Cross inspectors are already circling, and Washington is paranoid about bad press. These women are prisoners, nothing more, nothing less. You treat them according to regulations, you document everything, and you report any issues immediately. Crawford had nodded, understood. Then he met Greta Friedland, and understanding became complicated. Medical processing took 3 days. Every prisoner underwent examination, tuberculosis screening, general health assessment, documentation of injuries or chronic conditions. The women were examined by Eleanor Hoffman and 2 other female nurses under the supervision of Captain Morris, the camp physician. Greta's turn came on the 2nd day. She entered the medical office and saw the examination table, the instruments laid out with precision, the bright overhead light that made everything clinical and exposed. Eleanor gestured to a chair. "Please sit," Greta said. Eleanor opened a file folder, pen ready. Name? Friedland, Greta. Nurse, German Auxiliary Forces. Eleanor's pen paused. "You're a nurse?" "I was before." The examination proceeded in careful professional silence. Height, weight, visual assessment. Eleanor's hands were gentle but efficient, checking for signs of malnutrition, disease, injury. She noted scarring on Greta's hands, chemical burns, likely from disinfectants. An old fracture in the left wrist, healed incorrectly. Malnutrition, moderate. Dehydration, resolving. No active infections. You'll need dental work, Eleanor said, making a note. Several cavities, one possible abscess. We'll schedule that. Greta nodded. In Germany, dental care had become a luxury reserved for frontline troops. Nurses made do with aspirin and hope. Eleanor closed the file. You worked in hospitals? Hamburg, then field stations near the front. Then capture. I trained in Boston, Eleanor said, then stopped as if surprised by her own words. Fraternization guidelines were clear, but this was a professional conversation, nurse to nurse. Surely that was different. Greta's expression shifted slightly, not quite a smile, but a recognition. You have good training. I can see it in how you work. Eleanor felt something unexpected, pride, then immediately felt ashamed of that pride, as if accepting a compliment from the enemy somehow betrayed her uniform. Thank you, she said quietly. That's all for today. But as Greta stood to leave, Eleanor added, if you experience any pain, any health issues, you tell the guards immediately. We have medical supplies here. There's no reason to suffer. Greta paused at the door. In Germany, we ran out of morphine in 1943. We ran out of penicillin before I even learned what it was. You have medical supplies here in a prison camp that our field hospitals never saw. She said it without bitterness, just observation. A nurse noting inventory. That evening, Eleanor wrote in her diary, examined the German nurses today. One of them, Friedland, has burns on her hands from working without proper equipment. She's competent, clearly trained, and has the same look we all had in Boston when we first saw trauma cases. I keep thinking, under different circumstances, we might have worked together. Isn't that strange? How arbitrary all of this is. Major Garrett faced a practical problem. What work to assign 73 women in a camp designed around male labor? The Geneva Convention stipulated that prisoners could be required to work, but the work had to be appropriate, safe, and compensated. The solution came from an unexpected source. The camp hospital was understaffed. 2 nurses had rotated out, replacements delayed. The workload was crushing 4,000 prisoners, plus American personnel, plus the inevitable injuries, illnesses, and emergencies that came with running what amounted to a small city. Captain Morris made the suggestion. Use the German nurses. They were trained, experienced, and desperate for something to do besides sit in barracks staring at walls. The camp needed them. Why not? The proposal went up the chain of command, generated weeks of bureaucratic debate, and finally came back approved with 17 pages of additional regulations. The German nurses could work in the hospital under direct American supervision. They would treat only German prisoners. They would be paid in scrip. They would have no access to medical records of American personnel. They would be supervised at all times. Greta received the assignment with the same efficient calm she had shown during processing. She was given a white apron, not a full nurse's uniform, but something that marked her as medical staff. The apron was clean, pressed, and 2 sizes too large. She rolled the sleeves and tied the waist tight. Sergeant Crawford escorted the first group of German nurses to the hospital on a Tuesday morning. The sun was already fierce, turning the dust between barracks into golden haze. He walked slightly ahead, maintaining the required distance, acutely aware of the absurdity leading enemy nurses to work in an American military hospital. At the hospital entrance, Eleanor was waiting. Crawford made the introductions formal and clipped. Corporal Hoffman will supervise your work assignments. You follow her instructions exactly. Any issues, any problems, You report immediately. Understood? The German nurses nodded. Greta met his eyes briefly, a look that contained neither defiance nor submission, just acknowledgement. Crawford felt oddly unsettled by it. Eleanor led them inside. The hospital smelled like every hospital antiseptic, bleach, and underneath it all, the sweet rot smell of infection that no amount of cleaning could completely eliminate. You'll work in the prison ward, Eleanor explained. German patients only. We have cases of pneumonia, several men recovering from work injuries, some chronic conditions. Your job is basic care vitals, medication distribution, wound dressing changes. I supervise all medications. No one administers anything without my approval. Clear? Greta stepped forward. We understand. May I see the patients? Eleanor hesitated, then nodded. She led them to the ward, a long room with 20 beds, 15 currently occupied. German prisoners looked up as the nurses entered. One man tried to sit up, winced, fell back. Another began speaking rapidly in German, gesturing at his bandaged leg. Greta moved to the first bed without being told. She checked the chart hanging at the foot, then gently examined the patient's breathing. Her hands moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this thousands of times. She spoke to the patient in low German, reassuring, professional. Eleanor watched and felt something shift in her understanding. These were nurses. Real nurses. The enemy, yes, but also professionals who had taken the same oaths, learned the same skills, faced the same impossible choices when supplies ran out and patients kept dying. Over the following weeks, a routine developed. The German nurses worked 8-hour shifts under American supervision. They proved competent, tireless, and grateful for the work. Greta, in particular, demonstrated skills that impressed even Captain Morris. She could set an 4-line in the dark, diagnose pneumonia by sound alone, and calm panicking patients with nothing but her voice. Crawford found excuses to check on the hospital more frequently than regulations required. He told himself it was supervision, making sure protocols were followed, ensuring no fraternization, no security breaches. But really, he was watching Greta work, watching the way she moved through the ward with quiet competence, the way she spoke to patients firm but kind, never coddling, always honest. The way she handled Eleanor's supervision without resentment, understanding that trust had to be earned. One afternoon in late April, Crawford entered the hospital during a shift change. Greta was removing her apron, preparing to return to the barracks. Her hands were raw from constant washing, the chemical burns on her knuckles reopened and weeping. You should have those looked at, Crawford said before he could stop himself. Greta glanced at her hands. It's nothing. Occupational hazard. It's an infection risk. In a hospital ward, the patients come first. Crawford felt something unexpected, frustration. Not at insubordination, she had done nothing wrong. But at the casual way she dismissed her own pain, the automatic prioritization of others that he recognized because he had seen it in every good medic he had ever worked with. Eleanor, he called. Can you treat her hands before she leaves? Eleanor appeared from the supply room. She looked at Greta's hands, then at Crawford, then back at the hands. Sit down, she said to Greta. Not a request. Greta sat. Eleanor brought out ointment, clean bandages. She worked in silence, coating the burns, wrapping the fingers with careful precision. You need to wear gloves, Eleanor said. We have them. There's no excuse for this. The patients need you healthy. If you get an infection, you're useless to everyone. Wear gloves. Greta nodded slowly. Yes, thank you. Crawford watched this exchange and understood something he had been avoiding. These were not just prisoners anymore. Not to him, and not to Eleanor. They had become colleagues. People with names and skills and hands that bled from work. The realization troubled him more than it should have. May 1945. Germany surrendered. The news came through official channels, first teletype messages, radio broadcasts, command directives. Then it spread through the camp like weather, impossible to contain. In the German barracks, the reaction was complicated. Some men wept. Some sat in silence, staring at walls. Others seemed almost relieved. The war was over. They had survived, and now there was only waiting. Waiting to go home. Waiting to discover what home had become. Waiting for whatever came next. The women's reaction was quieter, but deeper. Greta sat on her bed that evening and tried to calculate what Germany's surrender meant for her specifically. She was a prisoner of the Americans. The war was over. The Americans would begin repatriation. She would be sent back to Hamburg. To what? She had received one letter, forwarded through Red Cross channels, 3 months earlier, from a neighbor who had survived the firebombing. The letter was brief, factual, brutal. Your building is gone. Your parents evacuated to the countryside. I don't know where. The hospital is rubble. Most of the nurses are dead or missing. Hamburg is not what you remember. I'm sorry. Going back meant returning to ash. To a city that had been systematically destroyed. To a country that would be occupied, divided, reshaped by the powers that had defeated it. To parents she might never find. To a profession that had no hospitals left to practice in. But staying was impossible. She was a prisoner. Prisoners went home when the war ended. That was the rule. That night, Greta dreamed of Hamburg burning. She woke before dawn, heart racing, hands shaking. The room was dark and close. Through the window, Louisiana pines swayed in wind she couldn't feel. The next morning, during hospital rounds, Greta made a mistake. It was small. She administered a dose of pain medication 30 minutes early. A timing error that violated protocol that caused no harm to the patient. Eleanor noticed during chart review. You gave the morphine at 7 instead of 7:30. Greta looked at the chart, saw her error. Yes, I'm sorry. You don't make mistakes like this. What's wrong? Nothing. Greta. Eleanor's voice was gentle. What's wrong? And somehow, in the middle of a military hospital in Louisiana, standing between beds of sleeping patients, Greta told the truth. I don't want to go back. The words hung in the air like confession. Eleanor said nothing for a long moment. Then, we should talk, but not here. They met that evening in the small office attached to the ward. Eleanor brought coffee, real coffee, American coffee, impossibly strong and sweet. Greta held the cup in both bandaged hands and felt its warmth. Germany is destroyed, Greta said quietly. Everything I knew is gone. My hospital, my home, my parents, I don't even know if they're alive. And I'm a nurse without medical supplies, without hospitals, without anything to go back to. Eleanor sipped her coffee. You'll rebuild. With what? Germany lost. We have nothing left. You have skills, training. That doesn't disappear just because buildings burn. And you think Germany will need nurses? Greta laughed, bitter. Germany will need gravediggers. We'll be spending decades just identifying the dead. Eleanor had no answer for this. It was probably true. What do you want to do? She asked instead. Greta looked at her bandaged hands. I want to keep working. I want to do what I trained for. I want to help people instead of ... double quotes. She trailed off. Instead of what? Instead of returning to rubble? Instead of facing what her country had become? Instead of surviving when so many had not? I can't help you, Eleanor said carefully. I'm sorry, but I can't. You're a prisoner. There are regulations, procedures. When repatriation begins, you'll go back with everyone else. I know. They sat in silence, drinking coffee that had gone cold. June brought heat that made Louisiana feel like a physical punishment. The hospital was sweltering, despite fans running constantly. Patients suffered, staff suffered. The German nurses worked through it with the same stoic endurance they had shown for months. Greta's dress was falling apart. It had been worn daily for 3 months, washed weekly in harsh soap, dried in sun that bleached and weakened the fibers. The hem had come loose. The seams were splitting. The collar was frayed beyond repair. She requested a replacement through proper channels. The request was noted, filed, and disappeared into the camp's administrative machinery. Weeks passed. The dress deteriorated further. Greta attempted repairs with thread salvaged from supply packaging, but she was a nurse, not a seamstress. The stitching held for days, then failed. In early July, the right shoulder seam split completely. The dress hung askew, barely functional. Greta reported for her hospital shift wearing it anyway. She had no alternative. Sergeant Crawford saw her arrive and felt something snap inside him. This was not how things were supposed to work. Prisoners were supposed to receive adequate clothing. The Geneva Convention was explicit on this point. Basic necessities, food, shelter, clothing, were not privileges, but requirements. And here was a nurse, working in his camp's hospital, wearing a dress that was literally falling apart, because some bureaucrat in the supply office had lost her requisition form. He found Major Garrett in the administrative building. "Sir, we have a problem with prisoner clothing." Garrett looked up from paperwork. "What kind of problem?" "The German nurses. Their dresses are falling apart. Replacements were requested weeks ago and never arrived. I'll look into it. With respect, sir, that's not good enough. We have Red Cross inspectors coming next month. Do we want them to see prisoners working in rags?" Garrett leaned back in his chair. "You're right. I'll prioritize the request. Give me 48 hours. Crawford nodded. "Thank you, sir. But 48 hours was too long." Greta's dress was disintegrating in real time. By evening, the left seam had also split. She was holding the dress together with safety pins and willpower. Crawford made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He went to the supply warehouse, found a storage room that held confiscated civilian clothing items taken from prisoners during processing, laundered, cataloged, waiting for eventual return or disposal. He searched through boxes until he found what he needed: a dress, blue cotton, simple design, clean and whole. He signed it out using his authorization code, took it to the hospital, found Greta finishing her shift. "Come with me." She followed him to a small office. He closed the door and handed her the dress. "This is from supply. It's clean. It fits. Wear it tomorrow." Greta held the dress like it might disappear. "I don't understand. Your current dress is falling apart. This is a replacement. That's all. But the regulations say receive adequate clothing. That gray thing you're wearing is not adequate. This is." End of discussion. Greta looked at him with an expression Crawford couldn't read. Confusion, gratitude, suspicion, all mixed together. "Why are you doing this?" Crawford met her eyes. "Because you're a good nurse, and good nurses deserve better than rags." It was true. It was also incomplete. But it was all the truth he was willing to speak aloud. Greta took the dress. "Thank you." She wore it the next day. Blue cotton that fit properly, no pins required. Eleanor noticed immediately, but said nothing. Captain Norris noticed, but said nothing. The other nurses noticed and began submitting their own requests for replacement clothing. And Major Garrett noticed. He called Crawford to his office 3 days later. The conversation was brief and precise. "You signed out civilian clothing for a prisoner." "Yes, sir." "Her issued dress was falling apart. Through proper channels. You should have waited for supply to process the replacement request. Supply lost the request. The prisoner was working in inadequate clothing. I solved the problem." Garrett studied him. "You solved the problem by giving her civilian clothing that was not part of her authorized issue. It was better than the alternative." "The alternative being?" "A nurse working in a hospital while her dress falls apart. Red Cross inspectors documenting our failure to provide basic necessities. "Take your pick, sir." Garrett was quiet for a long moment. Then, "You're walking a very thin line, Sergeant." "I'm aware, sir. The German nurses are prisoners, not colleagues, not friends, prisoners. You remember that?" "Yes, sir." But Crawford left the office, knowing that he had already crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. He had seen Greta as a person first and a prisoner second. Once you made that shift, there was no going back. August 1945. Repatriation schedules began arriving from Washington. Lists of names, dates, transport assignments. The machinery of sending thousands of prisoners home was grinding into motion. Greta's name appeared on a manifest scheduled for September. Hamburg via New York. Standard processing, standard transportation. She would board a ship with 200 other repatriates and arrive in Germany 6 weeks later. She told Eleanor during a quiet moment in the hospital. "September," Eleanor said. "That's soon." "Yes. Are you ready?" "No, but ready doesn't matter." Eleanor wanted to say something comforting. Something about Germany rebuilding, about nurses being needed, about the future being less terrible than Greta imagined. But she had read the reports coming out of Europe. The devastation was beyond comprehension. Cities reduced to rubble, infrastructure destroyed, millions dead, millions more displaced. Germany would rebuild eventually, yes, but it would take decades, and it would be a different country emerging from the ashes. "I'll miss working with you," Eleanor said instead. Greta smiled slightly. "I'll miss having medical supplies." They both laughed, brief and bitter. That night, Crawford couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about Greta boarding a ship, crossing the Atlantic, arriving in Hamburg to find nothing waiting for her. A competent nurse with nowhere to practice. A woman returning to a destroyed homeland because regulations said prisoners go home when wars end. He made another decision. The next morning, he requested a meeting with Major Garrett. "I need to speak with you about the repatriation manifest." Garrett looked up. "What about it?" "Some of the German nurses have specialized skills, medical training that could be valuable. I think we should explore options for extended detention." "Extended detention? You mean keeping them here?" "Temporarily. Under special work programs. There's priced-in agricultural workers, technical specialists. The camp hospital could use the additional staff." Garrett leaned forward. "Let me be very clear, Sergeant. Are you asking me to delay repatriation for specific prisoners because you believe they're useful? Or because you've developed personal attachments that are clouding your judgment?" Crawford felt the accusation like a physical blow. "Sir, I'm thinking about the camp's operational needs. You're thinking about one nurse in particular. Don't insult my intelligence by pretending otherwise." The silence stretched between them. Finally, Garrett spoke. "I understand what you're feeling." "I do, but these are prisoners of war. The war is over. They go home. That's not negotiable, and it's not your decision to make." "Yes, sir." Crawford left the office knowing he had lost. Greta would leave in September. There was nothing he could do about it. The regulations were clear, the procedures established. His personal feelings, whatever they were, meant nothing against the weight of policy. But he couldn't let it go. 2 days before Greta's scheduled departure, something broke in the camp's careful order. It started with a rumor. One of the German prisoners being repatriated had received a letter from Germany, a letter describing conditions in Hamburg, starvation, disease, former military personnel being hunted by Soviet agents, women attacked in the streets. The letter was graphic, desperate, and possibly exaggerated, but it spread through the barracks like fire. Several prisoners scheduled for repatriation began requesting delays. They wanted to wait, to see if conditions improved, to hear more news before making the journey home. The requests were denied. The manifests were final. Greta made no request. She packed her few belongings, the blue dress Crawford had given her, A worn toothbrush, 3 letters from the Red Cross that she had read so many times. The paper was translucent at the folds. She prepared to leave the same way she had prepared for everything. Quietly, efficiently, without complaint. Crawford found her in the barracks on her last evening. He shouldn't have been there. Regulations prohibited male personnel in the women's quarters except for emergencies. But he came anyway. "I need to talk to you." Greta looked up from her packing. "Sergeant Crawford, this isn't appropriate." "I know." "I don't care." She studied his face and saw something that made her set down the dress she was folding. "What is it?" "You don't have to go back." "Yes, I do." "The manifest. The manifest can be changed. There are programs, exceptions. If you applied for asylum, if you made a case—" "Stop." Greta's voice was firm. "Please stop." Crawford moved closer. "You told Eleanor you don't want to go back. You said Germany is destroyed. So don't go. Stay here. Work in the hospital. You're a good nurse, Greta. The best I've seen. You shouldn't have to." "Sergeant." Greta stood up. "I appreciate what you're trying to do, but I can't stay. Even if there were programs, even if exceptions existed, I can't. Do you understand why?" "No. Because I'm German. Because my country did terrible things. Because people need to see that Germans are going home to face what we created. If I stay here, safe and employed while my country burns, what does that say about me? What does that say about responsibility? You're a nurse. You saved lives. I served in a system that destroyed lives. The fact that I personally tried to heal doesn't erase what the regime did. I can't run from that. I have to go back." Crawford felt something crumbling inside him. "That's not fair. None of this is fair. But it's what has to happen." They stood in the small barracks room, surrounded by the meager possessions of women who had lost everything. Outside, Louisiana evening sounds drifted through the window. Crickets, distant conversations, the routine noises of a camp preparing for lights out. "I'll miss you," Crawford said quietly. Greta's expression softened. "I'll miss this place. I'll miss Eleanor. I'll miss having work that matters. But I can't stay, James. You know, I can't." It was the first time she had used his given name. The next morning, Greta reported for final processing. Standard procedure: medical clearance, documentation review, personal effects verification. She wore the blue dress Crawford had given her months earlier. Clean, whole, appropriate for travel. Crawford was assigned to escort her through processing. He told himself it was routine duty. He told himself he could maintain professional distance. He was lying to himself. In the processing room, a female corporal named Davidson was conducting the personal effects check. Greta stood patiently while Davidson reviewed her belongings against the inventory list. One dress, blue cotton. "This isn't on your original inventory. It was issued as a replacement during my detention." Davidson checked her paperwork. "I don't see authorization for civilian clothing. Sergeant Crawford provided it when my issued dress was damaged." Davidson looked at Crawford. "Is this true?" "Yes. The prisoner's issued clothing was falling apart. I authorized a replacement from confiscated civilian items. Civilian items aren't authorized issue for prisoners. She needs to be wearing standard prisoner clothing for transport." Crawford felt ice in his chest. The standard clothing was inadequate. That's not relevant. Prisoners being repatriated wear standard issue only. She needs to change. She doesn't have anything else. The original dress was disposed of. Davidson consulted her regulations manual. Then she need to be issued a new standard dress before transport. We don't have any. Supply has been waiting on replacements for months. Davidson's expression hardened. Then we have a problem. The standoff stretched. Greta stood perfectly still, understanding that she had somehow become the center of a bureaucratic dispute that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with her. Finally, Davidson made a decision. The dress needs to be removed and documented as non-standard issue. Shall travel in undergarments and be issued proper clothing at the port. Absolutely not, Crawford said. Excuse me? You're not sending her on a transport ship in her underclothes. That violates every dignity standard in the Geneva Convention. The Geneva Convention also requires prisoners wear appropriate identifying clothing. This civilian dress doesn't qualify. They faced each other across the processing table. Greta between them, silent. Crawford made a choice. He reached for the dress, gripped the fabric at the shoulder seam, and tore. The sound was shocking in the small room. The blue cotton ripped cleanly down the center, splitting from collar to waist. Greta gasped. Davidson stepped back. There, Crawford said, his voice shaking. Now it's damaged. Non-serviceable. You'll have to issue her a replacement. Davidson stared at him. Sergeant, did you just destroy government property? I destroyed a dress that was improperly issued. I'm correcting an administrative error by tearing clothing off a prisoner. I didn't tear it off. I tore it while it was being worn. There's a difference. Greta stood frozen, the ruined dress hanging from her shoulders in two pieces. Her eyes were wide, unreadable. Davidson reached for the phone on the wall. I'm calling Major Garrett. Do that. 10 minutes later, Garrett arrived. He took one look at the scene, the torn dress, Crawford's defiant stance, Greta standing silent, and exposed and understood immediately that something had broken beyond repair. Sergeant Crawford, step outside. Sir, I can explain. Outside now. Crawford left. Through the door, he could hear Davidson explaining the situation. Greta saying nothing. Garrett's voice, calm and deadly. Get her a blanket. Get her appropriate clothing. And get this processed before the transport leaves. Crawford waited in the hallway. Other personnel passed, glancing at him with curiosity and judgment. He had crossed every line, destroyed government property, created a scene, let his personal feelings override regulations. But when he closed his eyes, all he could see was Greta standing in that torn dress, not ashamed, not angry, but somehow dignified in the midst of humiliation. Garrett emerged 20 minutes later. My office. Immediately. Major Garrett closed his office door and gestured for Crawford to sit. Crawford remained standing. Do you understand what you've done? Yes, sir. Do you understand the reports I now have to file? The explanations I have to give Washington? The investigation that will be launched? Yes, sir. Garrett sat behind his desk. Explain to me why. Not the regulation you think you are enforcing. The real reason. Crawford struggled to find words. She didn't deserve that. Being forced to change, to travel in inadequate clothing, to be humiliated over a bureaucratic technicality. She's been a model prisoner, an excellent nurse. She deserved better. She's a prisoner, Sergeant. She's a person. She's both. And you seem to have forgotten which identity takes precedence. Maybe precedence is the problem, sir. Garrett steadied him. You've developed feelings for her. It wasn't a question. Crawford wanted to deny it, wanted to claim this was purely professional concern for prisoner welfare. But he was tired of lying, especially to himself. Yes, I have. Does she know? I don't think so. I never said anything. I never acted on it. Until today. Today, when you tore her dress in front of witnesses. I was trying to protect her. By humiliating her? The words hit like a punch. Crawford had been so focused on preventing Davidson's humiliation forcing Greta to strip down that he had unconsidered his own action as humiliating. Tearing her clothing, exposing her to shock and shame. I didn't mean. Intent doesn't matter. Outcome matters. And the outcome is that you destroyed her clothing, created a scene, and put both her and yourself in an impossible position. Crawford felt everything collapsing. What happens now? To you, you're being reassigned, effective immediately. You'll transfer to Camp Shelby in Mississippi pending investigation. Whether you face formal charges, Depends on what the investigators find. And Greta? Nurse Friedland boards her transport tomorrow as scheduled. She'll be issued appropriate clothing, and she'll go home to Germany, where prisoners go when wars end. Can I? No. You cannot speak to her. You cannot see her. You are to have no further contact whatsoever. Those are not suggestions, Sergeant. They are orders. Crawford nodded slowly. Yes, sir. You're a good soldier, Crawford. But you forgot something important. We don't get to choose who we care about in war. We only get to choose whether we let that caring destroy our judgment. You made the wrong choice. Greta boarded the transport ship wearing a new gray dress, government issue, properly sized and documented. Eleanor was there to see her off. They embraced briefly a violation of regulations that no one bothered to report. Take care of yourself, Eleanor whispered. You too. Greta wanted to ask about Crawford, where he was, what had happened to him, why he had done something so inexplicable and terrible and somehow kind. But asking would make Eleanor complicit in whatever feelings existed between them, so she said nothing. The ship departed on schedule. Greta stood at the rail and watched Louisiana disappear into the distance. Somewhere in that landscape was a camp where she had worked as a nurse, earned wages, felt competent for the first time in years. Somewhere in that landscape was a man who had torn her dress to pieces because he could not bear to see her humiliated. She never saw him again. Crawford served out his transfer to Camp Shelby. The investigation concluded that while his judgment had been questionable, no formal charges were warranted. He received a written reprimand in his file and continued his service until his discharge in 1946. He returned to his wife and daughters in Ohio, resumed civilian life. Never spoke about what happened at Camp Rustin, though his wife noticed he sometimes paused when news from Germany appeared in the papers. Eleanor remained at Camp Rustin until the camp closed in 1946. She went on to a distinguished nursing career, eventually becoming director of nursing at a hospital in Boston. In her private papers, discovered after her death, she wrote about the German nurses she supervised. They taught me that professionalism transcends nationality. In her panned that healing is the same work, regardless of what flag you serve. Greta returned to Hamburg. The city was exactly as terrible as she had feared. She worked in a makeshift hospital in the ruins, then in a Red Cross facility, then in one of the first rebuilt hospitals. She never married. She trained dozens of young nurses in post-war Germany and was known for her exacting standards and surprising kindness. In 1967, a documentary team filming a series about post-war reconstruction interviewed her. They asked about her experiences as a POW in America. It was strange, she said carefully, being the enemy in a place where people treated you like a person. I worked in their hospital. I wore their clothes. And I learned something important, that even in war, even as prisoners, we had choices about how to treat each other. The interviewer asked if she had any specific memories from the camp. Greta was quiet for a long moment. There was a dress, she said finally. Blue cotton. Simple. A sergeant gave it to me when mine fell apart. And when I was leaving, when regulations said I couldn't take it, he destroyed it rather than let bureaucracy humiliate me. I've thought about that moment for 20 years. About what it means when someone ruins something beautiful to prevent something worse. Do you know what happened to him? No, I never learned his name, but she was lying. She had known his name was James. She had known he was married with daughters. She had known exactly what he risked and why. And somewhere in Ohio, James Crawford watched that documentary, saw Greta's face, older but unmistakable, heard her describe a dress he had torn, a moment he had relived 1,000 times, wondering if he had done the right thing. His wife noticed him crying and asked what was wrong. Nothing, he said. Just an old memory. Some stories don't have clean endings. Some moments of human connection occur in contexts so complicated that they can never be fully resolved, only remembered. Greta and James never spoke again, never wrote, never acknowledged what passed between them in a Louisiana prison camp in 1945. But they both remembered a torn blue dress. And they both understood that sometimes the most profound acts of dignity involve destruction. That protecting someone's humanity can look like violence. That the distance between care and control is measured in seams ripping, fabric falling, and the terrible grace of letting go.